People hear about Portsmouth, New Hampshire as an historic place.
Here's this town that's been here for 400 years almost, and they're very history conscious, and they know who they are, and they know their story. And it sounds a little bit like the history of America, but it's not quite the same story you're used to.
We have a great colonial history. People know about Paul Revere.
We're telling an alternative story to the Mayflower. We're saying, well, that's sort of the way it happened, but really America wasn't founded for religious freedom. It was founded for capitalism.
People in Portsmouth made huge, really, contributions to the history of this country that's very little known.
So we're telling all these alternative viewpoints in one little tiny area.
Portsmouth isn't just a place in the history books, it's the place where people wrote history.
And to me, it's almost like an alternative history of America.
In the colonial era, small Portsmouth was the fourth largest city in America at that time. There were many people in Portsmouth who made their fortunes either as shipbuilders, like John Langdon, and people who were sea captains, merchants. The brick row of warehouses down on the waterfront, Bow Street, are all original brick warehouses from that era.
Portsmouth is basically one of 5 or 6 major ports on the coast. So it's very important. It's equivalent in many ways to Virginia. There's nothing really equivalent to it, sort of Portland, but really between Virginia and Canada. So it's a main port. We are very much in favor of the king. I mean, we like the king because the king is where our money comes from. I mean, our royal governor works for the king. The people who are wealthy are working for the king. When Paul Revere comes running up and starts screaming, the British are coming, which is basically what he does. He's wrong, by the way, they aren't coming. That they're going to take all the gunpowder from Fort William and Mary. The colonists suddenly realize, wait a minute, if the king's going to take all the gunpowder, we won't be able to defend ourselves.
Paul Revere, there are records of his calling a quick meeting at Studley's Tavern, which is still there at Strawberry Bank. Local people, including a Whipple, gathered together the militia, told the garrison of 6 British soldiers that they were seizing control of the gunpowder. Not a shot was fired, no one was injured. The American militia took control of the gunpowder, took it up the river to Exeter, and that gunpowder was later used in the Battle of Bunker Hill.
And that battle is fought in many ways by more New Hampshire men than men from any other state, for which we get no credit, no attention. You'll never find it in a history book. So that's why we have to tell the story so loudly.
When it came time for the colonial government to start a navy, they started it here in Langdon's shipyard, building ships to sail against the British. And a gentleman named John Paul Jones came to Portsmouth, and he lived here in the building that now houses the Portsmouth Historical Society Museum. And when he finally took command of his ship and sailed off to England to carry the revolutionary fight to the British in their home turf, he sailed with men from Portsmouth and Kittery and all around here because they were the best at what they did. We also had African slaves here. As a result of hearing what their masters had been saying in the drawing rooms of Portsmouth, 20 African slaves in those households signed a petition to the New Hampshire legislature for their freedom, using the language of the Declaration of Independence that they had been hearing people debate under their noses for months. The document, of course, given the time, wasn't taken particularly seriously, but reading it today, it is an eloquent, beautifully phrased, convincing argument of we are totally in agreement with the principles of freedom and liberty granted under God, and now it's your turn.
When you think of the industrial era, remember that between the wars and the industrial era around the time of the Civil War, there's this kind of real dip in the economy. The shipyard's moving, but it's not. The shipyard really functions during wars. So if there's no big war, the shipyard's kind of in the doldrums.
What we did have was a huge brewery, thanks to Frank Jones. He did everything. He built breweries, he built factories, and he built hotels.
And he turns Portsmouth industry into one of the largest breweries in the nation. So that is a Portsmouth success story if you consider it to be the success story of one guy. Because Portsmouth is so poor and because it's done so badly, that a lot of the buildings built in the 1700s, some even in the 1600s, are still standing. They haven't been torn down because we haven't had that much progress. And people start saying, hey, look at Portsmouth, it's kind of a neat little town. It's not pretty, but there's some, there's the water and there's the old rotting docks. And so it's reminding them nostalgically of the early time period. And that actually becomes kind of the beginnings of cultural tourism. So Portsmouth has to come up with stuff for people to do. And so we become quickly, early good at entertaining visitors. The Treaty of Portsmouth in 1905 is definitely significant. We're finding out today that it's, in many ways, more significant to us now in some ways than it was then, because it's a very rare example of people sitting down at a table and ending a bloody battle.
The Russians and the Japanese were fighting what is now called World War Zero over Manchuria and Korea.
In 1905, Teddy Roosevelt has the idea of taking this horrible war that's going on between the Japanese and the Russians. 500,000 people are dead, almost as many people as our Civil War, which is one of the bloodiest battles in history. And so he asks them to come to, of all places, Portsmouth, New Hampshire.
After about 10 days of formal negotiations, the two sides had resolved everything but two issues, and the conference broke off. There was every indication that the two sides were just going to go home. At that point, the people of Portsmouth did what they always do, which is do something about it. There were dinners, there were lawn parties, there were musical entertainments at the music hall. That kept both sides in Portsmouth long enough for a sudden outbreak of reason. And the Treaty of Portsmouth, as it is known, was signed on September 5th, 1905.
So when it's all over, not only has a peace been declared and thousands of people won't die, at least until World War I, which comes a little bit later, but you've got Portsmouth as being a famous place. Meanwhile, the Navy Yard comes and goes depending on the war. So when you've got, Spanish-American War, you've got all these big bursts of building. We build warships. And so there's a burst in the economy. So we think about tourism more when the burst is low. And what you've got is this military-industrial complex going on at one end, and you've got this kind of cultural, family-oriented tourism thing going on the other end.
Basically, what happened early on is that the shipyard was designated to build submarines. And Portsmouth Naval Shipyard launched the first U.S. Navy submarine in 1917.
At the same time, we're building the first house museums. So the kids are going to the Thomas Bailey Aldrich House, and the sailors are going down to the houses of entertainment.
Prescott Park used to be the red light district until the Prescott sisters decided this was not on, and things had to be done to clean up the area.
And they basically, if you think of it kind of like Monopoly in reverse, they're going to buy all the buildings and take them down. So when you go down there and look at the flowers in the park, you're looking at where the coal wharves were, the tankers were, the rotting wharfs were. It's really the efforts of these two little old ladies that changed the whole face of the waterfront during about the time of the Depression. Meanwhile, other groups of ladies are opening historic museums all around town. So you have the Colonial Dames opening the Moffat Ladd House, which is where William Whipple, the signer of the Declaration, lived. You've got the Warner House opening up, which is one of the oldest brick urban buildings in New England, a beautiful mansion. You've got the Wentworth Coolidge House, where Benning Wentworth, the former royal governor, used to live. You've got the Thomas Bailey Aldrich Museum opening up. You've got the John Paul Jones House opening up.
And the Portsmouth Historical Society really got started as a result of that effort, of people caring again about what happened here.
So we pull out of the Depression through war, through World War II. And by the time the war is over, that's really when the bad time hits. When the war ends and the shipyard starts to lay people off and everybody comes home from war, now you have a bad economy again. So what we start expanding, we start to go back to what we do so well, is the tourism industry. Portsmouth actually builds a preservation movement, and they save the area at Puddle Dock called Strawberry Bank.
Strawberry Bank is a 10-acre indoor-outdoor museum that depicts 400 years of Portsmouth history.
So now it's the early 60s, and we have an anchor. We have a village of old houses to go see.
We tell Portsmouth stories, and that's what it's all about. It's not about the crockery, it's about the people.
Well, I think the great thing about touring Portsmouth is that it's first of all, you can see Portsmouth in a day or two. It's a small, walkable town. There's always something to see, and it all fits together. You're not going to get it right away. It's not going to come to you. It isn't a soundbite. It isn't a simple history of America. The Pilgrims came, we fought the Revolution, that's it. It's a very complex, nuanced story of what America's all about that involves immigrants and men and women and children and people of all races and religions. And you begin to get to know the people in history here. It's about what America really is all about and what people were really doing here and what they're really fighting for and how complicated it is. If this is the way in to understanding your own history, because we're not talking about something that's inaccessible. We're talking about very accessible little downtown New England Yankee people. But a lot of these New England Yankee people were black, they were women, they were immigrants. What is a Yankee? And so once you start exploring that question, you can start asking, where do I come from? What is my family all about? And you can start going down that road, which is really the road to discovering the history of America. Because it's the history of you.